Welcome everybody, thank you so much for coming. My name is Mark Cho, I'm co-founder of the Armoury. This is Mr. Josh Shapiro, who is the mastermind behind this wonderful watch. And I'm really glad you could all join us this evening. Thank you so much for coming. Josh, you just arrived this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started?
Yeah, sure. So watchmaking started out as a complete hobby for me. In 2011, I got married. My wife got me a watch with a steel bracelet, and I walked into a watch store in Los Angeles called Feldmar. And I never really paid attention to luxury watches before, and I walked in and there's this big poster of a Chrono Swiss Opus, which was this skeletonized, beautiful watch, and I was just mesmerized. And I went home and started learning everything I could about watchmaking. And my first project, I literally took an old Unitus 6497 movement and completely destroyed it, trying to figure out how to skeletonize it. But I was really smitten. I just kept learning as much as I could. And it's almost ironic now. Back when I was skeletonizing watches for fun as a hobby, I thought, why in the world would anyone put a dial on a watch? Like, then you can't see everything on the inside. It defeats the entire purpose of a mechanical wristwatch. And then, learning more and more, and eventually I picked up a copy of George Daniels, which has inspired so many independent watchmakers, and read through the book and decided, okay, this is what I want to do. Now, where in the world do I start? And that's when I started looking deeply into engine turning. And I did a complete 180 and went deep into dial making as sort of my primary thing. I took a distance learning course with the British Horological Institute and did a year of study there. And instead of completing the exams, I bought my first engine turning machine. And engine turning is doing these geometric patterns on metal. And it's been around for 500 years, and in the 1950s, it really died as an art form. And so there's no one that teaches it. So a lot of how I learned was trial and error. And I took a deep dive into that and decided dials are where I'll start. And I'll learn as much as I can about guilloche, go as far as I can with that, and then see what I can do next. And in 2018, I started the Infinity series, and we were making the dials and the hands. Did that for a few years, and then finally we started making our own cases, and we started with tantalum, which was a wild place to start producing our own cases. It was very, very difficult. And then in the last few years, we've been prototyping our own movement as the last piece of the puzzle from the George Daniels book that I picked up over 10 years ago. I've been extremely lucky, and I've been able to grow the company to the point where we've been able to manufacture this movement and fulfill my dream of creating a watch from scratch, just like George Daniels talks about and did himself in his book.
Out of curiosity, because I've met a few members on your team, and they're very amazing, dedicated people, are they as familiar with the George Daniels book as you are?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Most of them.
Because that's a very specific way of making a watch, too.
Yeah, so George Daniels, he didn't apply any automatic machinery, no CNC machinery, and that was important to him, but it also meant he could only make one watch a year. So very early on, when I started launching my own brand in 2018, I realized if I want to sell more than one watch a year, I've got to employ some automatic methods. And so now, as we made the Resurgence, it takes about 300 hours of labor to make one of these watches. If we only employed manual hand-done methods, it would take about 3,000 hours. And so you can't really do that as a business. So every independent has to bring in automatic methods and then decide what do I want to focus on for the hand methods. And for us, that's the guilloche, the anglage, the damaskeening, and also within a watch there's all these small steel components, and we make a lot of those by hand and polish those by hand. So there's a lot of components that still get a lot of hand time, but a lot of like the really tedious parts that there's no nice way to say this, that aren't so interesting, we use our automatic machines for.
Because you pick up that watch and it feels like a handmade object. Like, do you have a theory for why it feels like a handmade object?
I think it's because of all the emphasis on guilloche and hand finishing on the movement. So the wrapping, so to speak, of this watch is all using handmade methods, and that's the reason it feels that way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And aesthetically, where does this aesthetic come from for you? Because it's also progressed a lot over the
Yeah,
years.
yeah. So originally I was inspired by George Daniels, who he himself was inspired by Breguet, and Breguet was inspired by a watchmaker named Lepine. And they all have this like classical aesthetic, very simple, very easy to read. Sometimes we forget as watchmaking progresses that these were very, very utilitarian devices, and the most important aspect of them was to quickly and easily be able to tell the time. And so I was very attracted to those designs, and over time, we developed our own font, and now in this one have gone to applied numerals, but the legibility is still really, really, really important to me. And I like the classic aesthetic, but I like exploring what creative things can I do within that classic dress watch aesthetic.
Okay. Well, thank you for that really great introduction. We're in a room full of pretty experienced collectors as well as some watch designers in our audience as well.
Ooh.
I think we should dig really deep this time, because
Okay.
this is not an average audience. So can we analyze this watch, starting with, let's say, the case? How
Sure.
did you put this case together?
So on this case, one really important thing was, how can I incorporate guilloche into a case that into this case that hasn't been seen before in a wristwatch? If you look at a Breguet pocket watch, there'll be guilloche on the back of the case and also on the mid case. And you never see that in wristwatches. The reason you don't see that in wristwatches is, in order to guilloche around the edge of a circle like a ring, you can't have anything interrupting it. Wristwatches have lugs. So we figured out a way to engine turn the mid case, and then afterwards mill recesses into the case to be able to insert the lugs inside of them. That way the guilloche is continuous all the way around it. And if I had to solder these lugs in, when you solder, it leaves some material on the outside, and you always have to polish afterwards. You rarely ever see a case that has soldered lugs that doesn't have like a polish all around it. But we can't do that with guilloche. That'll wreck the guilloche. So these lugs are screwed in from the inside. They pull the lugs in. And it was also...
Oh, sorry, please.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
No, please.
And the other aspect was, it was important for me to be thin, to have a low profile. So the overall case thickness is below 9 millimeters. But then we incorporated this really nicely domed crystal on the watch. And that's so that you can really get a great view of the movement. Sometimes with a low dome watch, you start getting distortion around the edges, but if the dome is high, then you've got a really nice view of everything going on in the dial. And I guess the last thing is, we have these dual finishes on the lugs. We've got the chamfer polished bevel on the side, and then the nice brush. And I think that creates a really nice juxtaposition.
Can you talk a little bit about the case back?
Yeah, sure. So I like simple. I've always felt that a lot of engraving and lettering on the case back will collect substances inside of it. If it gets damaged, it's hard to fix. So I've always really liked very simple case back designs. That's not to say like watches that have lettering there. There's just not my personal taste. And we've also incorporated these new crystals They have the double AR on both sides. So in some lighting, it almost looks like the crystal's not there. And that's pretty cool.
I'm super ignorant about this, but what's the rule for hallmarks on something like this?
Yeah, so every country is different. The United States has no rules, laws for hallmarks. You don't need to put anything.
Do you think you'll make a hallmark?
Yeah, we definitely could. In Great Britain, there's like a whole governmental steps you have to go to for hallmarking, but the United States is really easy. You don't even have to label it 18 karat if you don't want to.
Wow.
But I will on our watches. I haven't put anything on this prototype, so you just have to trust me, it's gold. Could be lead, gold-plated lead.
And I noticed you set the strap quite low down as well. What was that for?
So in most watches, there's nothing going on between the lugs. Your bracelet covers it up completely, or it's just machine marks here, or it's like a hard area to finish. It's a difficult area to machine when it's like a solid case. So to get in between the lugs, it's usually you see like vertical lines. Maybe you'll see a satin finish on the outside, and then you see vertical lines there. And that's sort of like from the shearing of the machining process. So like most brands just cover that up. Nothing interesting, nothing to see here. But here, since the engine turning goes all around, I wanted you to be able to get a full 360 view of the guilloche there. And that's why we put the lugs down lower. On the Infinity series, we actually did 2 sets of holes, so a person could use a curved strap or a straight strap, and it's much closer there. It's the same idea, on these frankly there's nothing to see there. It's just the same vertical lines that you see in most watch cases there. So we tried to bring the strap as close as possible. But this one I wanted to show off.
Can you talk a little bit about the dial?
Yeah, so where do I start? I'd made a few watches with applied numerals, and I really loved how they turned out, and I want to do that here. So our applied numerals, most applied numerals are made with like a stamping machine where they're going through and they're stamping just tens of thousands of applied numerals, even for the big brands. Our applied numerals, we machined each one individually. So they have pins on the back, they're machined from the back, and then each numeral we black polish. So we put a lot of time into those numerals. The numerals are also like a custom font that we had designed for us.
Yeah, you really notice the black polishing as you start to tilt the watch. Like it just suddenly flips in color. It's amazing.
Yeah, and gold's actually pretty tricky to black polish because it's soft. And soft means when you're polishing, little bits of abrasive are much more likely to get stuck in it, and then you get these awful streaks in it. Whereas steel is harder, so it's a little easier to black polish.
Interesting.
And then, we have our applied minute ring and seconds ring, and those are held down by secret hidden screws, which is a really elegant way to hold it down. And it also means it's easy to fix or refinish or anything with it because you just unscrew it, comes off. If you want to screw it back on, and then you just put a little dab of ink inside the recess where the screw is.
Is the dial plate thicker than normal?
Yeah, our dials are always pretty thick. On the Infinity series, it's about 0.8 thick itself, and then the chapter ring goes above that. Most dials that you see on most watches are about 0.4 millimeters thick. And that's because they don't need to be any more thick than that because there's not all this intense engraving on it. So the guilloche on here, we did a few special things that we hadn't done before. One is, and I don't get to talk about this too much, but this pattern is called a moire. And if you see here, really like zigzags and comes through. And this is the pattern you see on most watch dials. Shrinking this down to fit into a subdial is very challenging because the smaller the diameter gets, the messier it gets. So this pattern, it looks good full size for like the main part of a dial, but in a subdial it would look awful. So we had to invent a rosette, which is a part of a rose engine machine, to be able to get a moire that would curve like that in the subdial. And so that's what you see here, and that was actually a lot of work. There are two types of engine turning machines that make straight lines or vertical lines, and then a rose engine machine makes concentric lines. So I've done a lot of work with vertical line guilloche. That's how we do the basket weave, the infinity weave. But I'd never really done a deep dive into doing something really difficult with the rose engine. So that's what the subdial represents here. It was a really difficult pattern for the rose engine, and the waves that curve, they all line up with the dots for the 60 seconds in the subdial. And that was actually quite a bit of a challenge. So that's one neat aspect. Originally, I haven't told very many people this at all, but I was going to try to do something even crazier, but it didn't work. I wanted to do the subdial as a dome. So the engine turning would have been a moire on a dome, curved, but it was nearly impossible. That was a lot of wasted time, but it was fun.
And this is the infinity weave.
Yeah.
On the dial too, right?
Yeah, so in the central pattern is our infinity weave. On the infinity series, it's in the subdial, and it's microscopic. So on this one, I decided to put it on the center, and I did a squared version, so like one square higher, the size of it. And so you can actually see it with the naked eye instead of having to look through a loop to see the infinity weave itself.
Can you talk a little bit about the white finishing?
Yeah, so I'll get some water.
Please. We'll cut this part.
Yeah. I quit teaching a few years ago, so my stamina is down. Like I need to take breaks. I used to be able to put kids to sleep with 45 minutes straight of talking. So this is raw silver. This is what silver looks like right off the machine. It's got this really beautiful look to it. This is sterling silver. It's 92.5% silver, and then the other 7.5% is some copper. In this silver, there's some other metals in it that help it not tarnish. But this is what raw silver looks like. On this dial, this is also the same exact silver. Same exact silver we use here, but it's white, and that's not from painting. That's not from a plating process. That's something called Breguet frosting or depletion gilding. And the way it works is you have this raw piece of metal, and you put direct flame on it from a torch. And you heat it up, and the oxides at the top turn black, the impurities turn black, and so it looks pretty awful, like this black, patchy dial. Then you take that and you put it into acid. The acid burns off those black impurities, and then you take it back to the torch, and you go again. You go back and forth until eventually you get a pure layer of silver at the top of the dial, and that's a matte white. And that's what Breguet frosting is. That's what the trade name is, depletion gilding, because you're depleting all the non-silver elements from it. That's what Breguet would do on their watches 200 years ago, not modern day Swatch Breguet. They plate their dials white. And if you see a Breguet watch from 200 years ago, they're still white. It's pretty incredible. That's what George Daniels and Roger Smith also do on their dials. It's very rare because it's super labor intensive. I've also scrapped so many dials from heating it up too quickly, and then it expands. And dials have to be super precise. So if it expands too much, then that dial is no good. You can't shrink it.
And you have to do this after you've done all the previous steps.
Yeah. It's a little nerve-wracking. Like a lot of watchmaking is you're doing the most difficult step, and it's the last step. Yeah.
how long does depletion and gilding take? So from start to finish?
So that process can take about an hour, but it's like the riskiest part of it. The engine turning is like technically the most challenging part. And for that, like it's a lot of adjustments to the machine that you're going through. You're like phasing the machine and making adjustments, but you get into a routine, and sometimes you make a mistake and it's scrap and you start over again. Whenever I'm engine turning, if I make a mistake, I always hope that it's at the beginning. Because there's nothing worse than getting to the end of engine turning for like 10 hours and then you make a mistake.
How sturdy is brigade frosting?
It's not. It's very, 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 it's a very thin layer. So if the watchmaker slips with the tweezers, it'll reveal this color material. Yeah, so it's high stakes. And when I hire my watchmakers, one of the tests I have them do is it's like, I don't know if you guys have kids, but there's a game, Don't Touch the Lava. So for the watchmakers, it's don't touch the brigade frosting. So they have to set hands on a dial that I've just freshly whitened. And if they slip and the hand falls, it scrapes the dial. So it's like it's a pretty intense test, but we make expensive dials, so we can't have people, dropping the hands or slipping on the surface.
If you do slip, can you?
You just re-whiten it.
Okay.
Yeah, you just refrost it.
Makes me feel slightly better.
Yeah, and you'll see that on brigade watches. You'll see brigade watches where people have slipped all sorts, and you'll see these scratches on these beautiful dials, and it always makes me cringe. But
so you could actually restore that, though.
You could, yeah, unless it's like a really deep scratch. If it's just a superficial scratch, then you re-whiten it and it goes away. And that's nice about it too, because I want these watches to be around forever. So that's an aspect of it, that any part of the dial, you should be able to take it apart and restore it so it looks just as it did when it was brand new. With a pad printed dial, that's very challenging to do because once the ink comes off, you've got to find someone that can reprint the dial. I guess I'm mostly talking in the vintage world where that's a challenge. New stuff, they just swap in a new dial, but the older the watch is, the more difficult it is to recreate a pad printed dial. But our dials, as long as it's a very competent watchmaker, they should, if they read George Daniels, they should be able to go through and bring it back just as it was. Awesome. And then the last aspect of the dial that I didn't touch on is I'm always trying to challenge myself and challenge my team and take engine turning guilloche to new levels that it's never been before. So to do that, I made levels on the dial. Literally, there are 4 steps in the dial. And each one of those steps is a separate piece of guilloche that we engine turned and then trimmed and then precisely aligned with the next step. So if you look at this underneath the loop, there's 4 steps. They're engine turned at 4 different times, but the pattern aligns with itself.
Oh, I thought you just took one and cut it into 4 pieces. But I guess that would be impossible because you would damage just enough to...
Right, exactly. So if you have this table and you want to cut it in half, right, use a saw blade to cut it in half, but that saw blade has a thickness to it. So if you had a big triangle, or maybe if you had a big circle in the middle of this table and you took a saw blade and then you try to put that circle back together, there'd be a gap there, right? So it's the same thing with engine turning. If I have one piece of guilloche like this, and let's say I want to make this a step dial, 4 different layers. When I cut it, and then cut it, and then cut it, where that cut is, there's going to be a gap there. So when you put it together, it won't align. So what we did was we made 4 of these. Not this exact pattern, but in the dial. We made 4 of these and basically made an XY coordinate system. It knew exactly where we were and could trim and cut all 4 and line it up together. So it was a big project to do that. This first iteration of the Resurgence will be probably the only time I do this because it's super labor intensive. So I don't plan to do it in the future, but it's really cool, and it's really sort of a mechanical marvel that we're able to align from our really old machines, our engine turning machines, to our ultra modern machines to line them up like this.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Should we talk about the movement?
Yeah.
The movement's a big deal.
Yeah, so the movement was the final piece of the puzzle. You guys have all heard the term in-house movement before. Usually that means absolutely not an in-house movement. It's really become like a branding term that just means this is a proprietary movement to us. And most companies use subcontractors and bring the individual components together. Or some people pay a firm to design it and pay a firm to make it, but it's designed for them, so they call it their in-house movement. And there are a few watchmakers out there that really make everything themselves, like Roger Smith, Kari Voutilainen, Romain Gauthier. And I was super inspired by these guys and George Daniels. Like, when I got into watchmaking, like, this was like the pinnacle, to be able to do everything yourself in your own workshop. And so that's what in-house means to me, literally doing everything under one roof. And so it took millions of dollars and years and years and years, but we finally pulled it off with this watch. And not only that, most of the components, everything but the jewels and the springs, were made in the United States too, and that's the first time that's happened since Hamilton in the 1960s. So all these things were a really big deal to me personally, and my team shares these values. You know, we wanted to be able to be one of the few companies out there that's really doing everything ourselves, and sort of spur other watchmakers, especially in the States, to start bringing everything back to the United States to be able to make watches at the incredible quality that we used to have 100 years ago. Yeah.
The internal parts of a movement, you know, you were saying that some of the hardest parts to make are the ones that the user never even sees.
Yeah, yeah.
And in theory, you could source those from a Swiss company.
Yeah. And that's what a lot of people do. They'll harvest from an existing movement, or these big firms in Switzerland. You know, Switzerland, the industry never died there. It got contracted during the quartz crisis, but it never died. So, you know, you can go to a company and they'll, like a watch wheel. You know, there's a company in Switzerland where you can just order 10,000 watch wheels to your designation, or another component, or a balance wheel, or whatever it is. The United States doesn't have any of that infrastructure. And even though nobody sees these parts, you know, we've shed lots of sweat and tears making some of these super challenging parts. Like, for instance, in this setting mechanism, this is the sliding pinion right here, because it slides. This red component right here. And this is the winding pinion over here. This engages here with the crown wheel that drives the ratchet wheel. Believe it or not, these are the two most challenging parts to make in a watch. You never see them. They're not like a beautiful part. They're almost always hidden. But to make these manually, like we do, takes 3 days, each one of these parts. They've got to be machined in a soft material. They're double-sided parts with complex tooth profiles. And then after you've made it, then you have to harden them so that the teeth don't wear. But since it's a watch, you need to have very little friction, so they have to be polished. And at any point in that process, it's easy to screw it up. And that does happen pretty frequently. But that's sort of effort that goes into it, that challenge is why we do it. It's what makes it really enjoyable. It's the journey part of making a watch. Yeah.
There's other than obviously the great achievement, there's also a practical aspect to it as well, isn't there? Like compared to using off-the-shelf parts, making your own parts, what's the practical benefit of that?
Yeah, so I mean, well, there's two practical benefits. Like I don't have supply chain issues. My supply chain issues are me issues. I've got no one to blame but myself and ourselves if something's taking too long. And the other aspect of it is a lot of watches are based off of older movements. So sometimes you'll see a watch that like the sub-seconds is really close to the hours, and you kind of look at it like, oh, that's kind of like why is that there like that? Or, like this is a small case and like the movement takes up the whole thing, and when you're using someone else's movement or basing a watch off of someone else's movement, you're completely a slave to whatever watch they designed it for. So when you make your own movement, you can start, hey, I want the distance from the hours to the seconds to be this amount. So on my watch, it's 8.25 millimeters, right? I spent down, I designed the dial, I'm like, this is it. This is the golden ratio. I love this. I want it to be 38 millimeters. And then, after I figured out those two things, then I designed the movement. And that's a huge difference versus like a lot of watches are unitus based, and they're from the hours to seconds is 10.25 millimeters. So it's a big difference. It's a big distance. Or sometimes you'll see watches based off of the ETA 7001, which has a tiny distance between the hour, minutes, and seconds. And so to do what we wanted to do, we did it completely from scratch, and that's the bonus. We can make the watch exactly how we want it. No compromises, no being a slave to other people's components. It's a very difficult path, but very rewarding.
And is that why you have 3 different movement layouts?
Yeah, so there's a company called Touchon. They're a pocket watchmaker in the 1920s. They made pocket watches even to a higher quality than Patek Philippe. And I've always loved their watches. They only existed for a few years, but you could choose between 2 different movement layouts. Used to be back in the day for pocket watches, you could choose your own case, right? They'd have different case makers. It was different than the movement makers. But Touchon, you could choose between 2 different movement designs. And back when I was getting started and I discovered this brand, I thought that was so awesome. So since we're making all the difficult, invisible parts that you don't see in a watch, that's where most of the labor is. Doing different bridge layouts isn't nearly as difficult as making all these components. So we designed 3 different bridge layouts. So just like Touchon, you can choose between 3 different bridge layouts that have 3 very different design languages. And it's just a way for customers to have more expression inside of the watch. And it's fun for us, frankly. Like I designed 2 of these movements. One of my watchmakers designed 1. And it's just another way we can put more meaning and more art and more choice into the watch. One of the designs has like 14 internal angles. So like for the internal angle lovers, that's their movement. Another design is very traditional, finger bridges. And then the design that's in the movement is this nice, curvy, very organic movement. Yeah.
Amazing. Listen, man, thank you so much. That was so informative. I think it's time to open up to questions. Who wants to start?
One of these were not designed by you.
You should guess.
Yeah, which one do you think? That was this one?
Straight one?
Yeah,
Straight one?
the straight one. Yeah, Michael is a very talented watchmaker, and he came up with this idea. It's like
I mean, I've
very
never seen anything like
MC Escher-esque. Yeah, if you take a look at that, you'll see, especially for the escape wheel, it's the last bridge before the balance. There's like a an internal cutout inside of the wheel. So it's an internal inside of an internal. So that alone takes a day just to get the anglage on that. Just want to pass that around. And then,
Actually, Michael designed it, but does Michael actually have to make it or not?
no, so he does not
So
have
someone
to
else's
finish
problem.
it. Yeah, Spencer does the anglage on that one. Yeah, I'm really lucky. Like my watchmakers are all really multi-talented guys. Like when I started, I kind of had to learn everything. I had to learn how to machine, had to learn the watchmaking, had to learn the engine turning, and it means you're never bored. You always have a lot of variance in your job. And so all my watchmakers are like that too. These are the guys that went to watchmaking school and love making components. And in watchmaking school, most watchmakers, they learn these skills and they learn how to service watches, and then they go and they're a slave to Rolex for the next 20 years, just servicing watches like a robot day in and day out. And believe it or not, some people don't want that as their career. So the guys I have are the guys that love making components, don't want to service watches all day long, and so they learn all the different skills. And so most of my guys are comfortable sitting down, machining a component, or engine turning, or servicing a watch, putting it together. So it's a much more happy workplace than if someone's just sitting there doing one thing over and over again.
I listened to your lecture earlier this year in New York, and you mentioned some American watchmakers, like I think Keaton Murray.
Oh yeah.
And I was just curious, like now that, since the success of the Infinity series and now the Resurgence, are you getting other kind of up and coming watchmakers in America coming to you to get advice? And maybe we'll see this resurgence of watchmaking in America.
Yeah, for sure. Like I don't know if you guys have heard of the app Discord, but it's like it's used by gamers. But I'm in a Discord server with like 250 watchmakers all across the United States and the rest of the world. And so like I share a lot of knowledge in there, and a lot of other guys share knowledge, and people work for all sorts of different brands, and all helping each other out. And it's a big part of my mission statement, and the company's mission statement is that we share our knowledge publicly and professionally. It's really, really, really important. It's really rewarding too. A lot of a lot of companies are very secretive with what they do, and I understand that. I get that. A lot of R&D and research goes into making watches, or really anything. But I like to share as much as I can. If someone wants to do what we've done, like, good luck. It's not, you're gonna have to work for it. Like, I can give you the complete CAD drawing, like Marco Lang has done for an entire watch, and I'm not really afraid that someone's gonna come and do what we did, like, overnight. Like, it's just not like that. It's like, if you want to build a hypercar, like, it just, there's no getting around it. It's just hard work and years of trial and error. Like these components, like just to make this, is hours and hours of like trial and error on like tiny, tiny details. And that's just the prototype manufacturing process. There's no beating around the bush. There's no shortcuts. Yeah.
I have some questions from people on the internet.
Ooh.
The infinity weave, it's physically demanding to do an infinity weave.
Yeah.
So why is that?
So a Rose engine machine is operated by hand. You're turning a wheel, and that wheel is either turning a machine and moving the dial in a circle, or it's moving it up and down. So you're sitting there and you're turning a wheel. And then your other hand is pushing a metal cutter into the metal. So this is spinning, and I'm pushing a tool with my thumb into the metal to cut these lines. So there's a lot of stress on the left hand. And then you're doing this motion, like back and forth. And the infinity weave, in order to pull it off, it's 4 baskets inside of a larger basket. And if you just look at the way it works, we're doing zigzags. You can't do those 4 little baskets as a continuous cut because it would cut into the big baskets. It's hard to visualize. I did a lecture at Horological Society of New York in 2019, and I show a video of how we do the infinity weave. But basically, I'm doing a 0.3 millimeter cut line. Like, we're talking like microscopic line, and I have to stop within that distance. Otherwise, I cut into the big baskets. So that means I'm making a movement about this big with this hand, like starting and stopping, about that much movement. And then same thing here. I'm applying pressure and then pulling it off, all within like a tiny, tiny, tiny little distance. So you have to take breaks. You have to I did enough of it where I had to take a break for a long time because I really wore out my wrists. Physical therapy, all sorts of stuff, and learned like techniques for ergonomic techniques for how to engine turn so I don't, like I was pushing like this. I had to learn to like push with my shoulder, all sorts of little things, but yeah, it's pretty physically demanding. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about American damaskeening? Because that's a specific thing. It's different from Swiss damaskeening.
Yeah, so you guys are probably all familiar with Cotes de Genève. Cotes de Genève is made by taking a spinning abrasive. If you guys think of a pencil and the eraser at the end of a pencil, it's something like that, except it's spinning, and that's charged with like a diamond paste at the end of it. And that's going up and down, and that creates that line. And it's made on like a machine that's dedicated for it, just making straight lines. Damaskeening is the same process. It's a spinning abrasive, except it's on our straight line machines, which are capable of doing curves and are capable of being indexed to create geometric patterns just like guilloche is. So it's a mix of those two things. And it was something that American pocket watches used to heavily have on them. These beautiful damasking patterns that sort of look like guilloche shapes, except it's all rubbed onto the metal instead of cut into the metal like this. So we did that on our movements, which are raw German silver. We polish the surface to almost like a mirror polish, and then we do our damaskeening on top of it using a motorized tool doing this circular abrasive on a 120-year-old engine turning machine to do curvy lines. And that doesn't exist anywhere. That wasn't taught anywhere. So it was literally us just completely experimenting and messing up a lot of times and just trying to figure out what looked nice. And we came up with like 2 patterns here, but like the patterns are endless. Like the combinations are endless. We could do thousands of different patterns. So we just kind of decided on these because they look the best. And the way our damaskeening looks is very different even than like American damaskeening looked 100 years ago. They had to do it, they would do like 1 or 2 lines. We're doing like 20 or 30 lines on ours because we have the time to do that where they're mass producing 1 million watches. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to ask 2 more. Does anyone have line? No? Why do you actually write the initials of all the watchmakers on the movement, right?
Yeah. That's really important to me. Like, I do my part in every watch. I do a lot of the engine turning, and like the making of the individual components, I don't do anymore, right? I have a team, they do it. And so everyone is working super hard on these watches, and I want them to have recognition on it too. They're definitely a part of the journey. So every watchmaker that's a part of it, their initials go on the movement, and that's really important to me. I think my watchmakers appreciate it. That it's not just some egomaniac Josh Shapiro has to have only his name on every watch. If I could do it all over again, I probably would do like a eponymous name, but it's okay.
All right, well, to close it out, where do you want to be? 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now?
Yeah, so we want to keep doing more complications. Definitely the next complication we want to do is a chronograph. Most people, when they think of really hard complications, they think of, a tourbillon is a really tough complication. They think of a perpetual calendar, they think of a minute repeater. The truth is a chronograph's more difficult than all of those. It has more moving components. The components themselves are more difficult to manufacture. It just happens to be it's a super popular complication because it's practical, it's beautiful. So people have gotten so good at making chronographs that even though it's the most complicated, it's super out there. But there's never been a chronograph made in the United States as a wristwatch. We made them as pocket watches, but never as wristwatches. And it just gives us, there's a lot to explore with it. There's a lot to explore with decoration. There's a lot to explore with finishing. And there's a lot technically to explore with it. So that's one thing I want to pursue. And we want to keep pursuing other complications as well. Like that's part of the enjoyment of the journey. And now that we have a base, we can build on a base. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, well, Josh, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really, really wonderful presentation. And a round of applause for Josh. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.
Yeah. Thank you all.